I don't think the BDS movement goes far enough. It should go much farther. And for example, it should, I think, adopt Amnesty International's demand that Western countries impose an arms embargo on Israel, as was done in the case of South Africa in 1977. It hasn't done that yet, but the Human Rights Watch just called on Europe to put an end to to purchase of goods from the settlements or any other actions that might support the occupation. Well, it's a pretty conservative organization. Yeah, I think Europe ought to do that. The United States as well. So there's a lot that can be done. But when you carry out actions like any action, any protest action, you have to, if you're serious about it, you have to ask some questions. One question you have to ask is, what's the effect on the victims? You have to make a distinction between tactics that make you feel good and tactics that actually help the victims. So to take another case, in the case of the Vietnam War, there were sections of the American young activist movements, the weathermen, who decided that the way to oppose the war was to march down the street and smash windows and so on. The Vietnamese didn't like that, and they didn't like it for a very good reason. It helped create support for the war. What they called for, very properly and openly, was nonviolent actions, like, for example, their proposal, women demonstrating silently in front of a cemetery. They thought that was great, but not smashing up windows on Main Street. And the reason is they cared about the consequences. They didn't care whether American protesters felt good. They didn't care at all about that. They want to know what's going to happen to them. And exactly the same questions arise constantly. So quite apart from questions of principle, what happens if you call for a boycott of, say, Tel Aviv University? It's a gift to the hard right. They're going to come back right away, as in fact they do, and say this is total hypocrisy, as it is. Why don't you call for a boycott of Harvard or Oxford, let's say, which have much worse records than Tel Aviv University? And you don't have any answer to that. So you're giving them a gift. You're allowing them to discredit the whole movement by charges of hypocrisy. And if you have the interests of Palestinians at heart, you don't do that. There are what are called negotiations going on with the United States mediating a conflict between the two sides. And Europe accepts this. Europe discusses this as if these are negotiations. Europe is timidly following along behind the master. Doesn't have to, but it is. If there were serious negotiations, they would be conducted by some neutral party. For 35 years, the U.S. has been blocking a political settlement. Europe disagrees in words, but nevertheless goes along with the master, and the political settlement is supported by the entire rest of the world. And everyone knows pretty much what it is. Don't have to run through it. Well, as long as that continues, it's going to be like South Africa right through the 1980s. And there can be a change, but the change is going to have to come in the United States and in Europe. And as long as, say, in Belgium, it's impossible to discuss this topic, the change is not going to come in Europe. Changes have to be here. It's here that it's going to be necessary to carry out the educational, organizational, other activities, which will lead to breaking the opposition to a political settlement, the opposition to any rights for the Palestinians. That's preventing anything from happening here and, of course, in the United States. If you take a look at WikiLeaks, most of it is what you'd expect to find in diplomatic cables, but that's true if you look at declassified documents generally. However, there are real revelations. So, for example, take, say, Honduras. There are leaks from the American embassy in Honduras, which didn't get reported for pretty obvious reasons. You'll recall that in 2009, there was a military coup in Honduras, which overthrew the elected government, and the Obama administration, after some vacillation, ended up supporting it. opposing almost all of Latin America and even most of Europe. Well, one of the WikiLeaks cables comes from the U.S. Embassy in Honduras, right at the beginning, which says they've investigated the expulsion of the president, and they give a long analysis, and they conclude that it's illegal and unconstitutional. All right, that went to Washington, where the U.S. administration disregarded it, refused to call it a military coup, and went ahead and supported it. But maybe the most sensational leak, which really ought to get headlines, is from Pakistan. There are cables coming from the American ambassador in Pakistan, Ambassador Patterson, who incidentally supports U.S. policy in Afghanistan and Pakistan. But what she's pointing out repeatedly is that U.S. policies in Afghanistan and Pakistan, first of all, are making the population so anti-American that, it's approaching 100% anti-American extremism. And they're also threatening to radicalize and destabilize Pakistan. What she's pointing out is that, and the leaks are pointing out, is that U.S. policies in Afghanistan and Pakistan are threatening to bring about a situation in which fissile materials will leak into the hands of radical Islamists. Now, this goes back a ways. There are two crucial tendencies that have been developing in Pakistan since the Reagan years. One is the development of nuclear weapons, a huge nuclear weapons capacity. That's one of Ronald Reagan's gifts to the world with his allies. The Reagan administration and their allies pretended they didn't know that Pakistan was developing nuclear weapons. Of course they knew, but they pretended that they didn't so they could continue to support the dictatorship. The dictatorship was the worst dictatorship in Pakistan's awful history, Zia-ul-Haq, who was not only developing nuclear weapons, but was carrying out radical Islamization of the country with Saudi funding. And the West was supporting that. That means these madrasas in which people only study the Quran and jihad and so on. And it's spread. You go back a couple of weeks, remember there was an assassination of a Pakistani political figure who condemned the blasphemy laws, and right afterwards there were huge demonstrations supporting the assassins, and those demonstrations included, crucially, the progressive reformist elements in Pakistan, the young lawyers who were instrumental in overthrowing the Musharraf dictatorship. They were protesting in support of the assassin. They're the products of the madrasas. It's not a majority of the population, but there's a strong stream of radical Islamism supported by the West, nurtured by the West, now substantial, including plenty of people involved in the nuclear weapons program and leading Pakistani nuclear physicists